On the night of my 62nd birthday, my daughter stood up in front of every person I loved and called the man sitting next to me, the man who had held my hand through the worst year of my life, a parasite. She said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. She said it with a smile on her face. And I watched my daughter-in-law start laughing first, then her sister, then her mother, until the entire left side of the banquet hall was shaking with it. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, with his arms crossed like a man who had just won something. And my daughter, my firstborn, the child I had driven to dance recitals and emergency rooms and college orientations, stood there in her red dress and waited for the room to go quiet so she could say more. I want to tell you what happened that night. I want to tell you everything, from the beginning, because if you are a mother, if you have ever loved a child more than you loved yourself, and if that child has ever made you feel like that love was the most foolish thing you ever did, then you will understand every word of this story. My name is Margaret. I am 62 years old. I live in a small house in Asheville, North Carolina, the same house where I raised 2 children after my husband passed away 11 years ago. My husband, Gerald, was a good man. He worked in insurance. He never raised his voice. And he died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning while I was at the grocery store buying oranges. I came home and found him on the kitchen floor, and I have never bought oranges since. After Gerald died, I went back to work. I had been a part-time bookkeeper for a local hardware store before the children were born, but I had been out of the workforce for over 20 years. I was 51 with a resume that looked like a relic. I applied for 32 jobs. I got one. Night shift supervisor at a laundromat chain. $12 an hour, 4 nights a week. I took it. I did that for 6 years. Then I found work as an office administrator at a small dental practice. Better hours, better pay, still not enough. But I managed. I kept the house. I paid what needed to be paid. I did not ask my children for anything. My daughter, Caroline, had married a man named Derek 8 years ago. Derek was in real estate. He had opinions about everything and knowledge of very little, which is a dangerous combination in a person. My daughter loved him completely, the way some women love men who make them feel like they are always slightly behind. Caroline had always needed someone to impress. When she was 12, she cried for 2 days because she got a B+ instead of an A on a science test. She married Derek because Derek made her feel like she had finally impressed someone important. I understood that about her. I loved her anyway. My son, Paul, had married a woman named Trish 3 years after that. Trish was pleasant enough on holidays and barely visible the rest of the time. She and Paul lived 40 minutes away. They had 2 children. I saw my grandchildren approximately 6 times a year, which was always my daughter-in-law's scheduling, never mine. I tell you all of this so you understand what my life looked like before Thomas. I met Thomas on a Wednesday afternoon in March at the public library of all places. I had started volunteering there on Wednesday afternoons after I retired from the dental practice. I sorted, donated books, helped with the children's reading program, made coffee for the staff. I liked the quiet of it. I liked being somewhere that asked nothing of me but my time. Thomas was sitting at one of the reading tables when I came in that afternoon. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and reading glasses held together on one side with a piece of tape. He had a stack of books next to him, history, mostly, and one book about migratory birds that seemed out of place. He looked up when I walked past and said, "Excuse me, do you know if this library has anything by Robert Caro?" I told him they had 2 of the Lyndon Johnson volumes and that I could show him where. He said he would appreciate that very much. I showed him. He thanked me. I went back to sorting books. He was there the following Wednesday, and the one after that. By the 5th Wednesday, we had talked enough that I knew he was a widower, that he had grown up in rural Vermont, that he had one son who lived in Seattle and called every Sunday, and that he had moved to Asheville 18 months ago because he liked the mountains and had no particular reason to be anywhere else. He never talked about work. He never mentioned money. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru that needed new wiper blades, and he wore the same 4 or 5 flannels in rotation, and when we finally had coffee together at the small cafe 2 blocks from the library, he ordered a medium drip and did not look at the pastry case. I liked him. I liked him the way you like someone who does not need anything from you, which at 61 years old is rarer than people think. We started having dinner together on Friday evenings. Nothing extravagant. The Italian place on Marymount Avenue or the Thai restaurant downtown, Or sometimes I would cook and he would bring wine and we would sit on my back porch until it got dark. He was funny in a quiet way. He listened when I talked. He never looked at his phone during dinner. These are small things, and they are everything. I introduced him to Caroline about 4 months after we started seeing each other. I did not plan a formal meeting. She stopped by my house one Saturday afternoon unannounced, the way she did sometimes, and Thomas was there helping me hang a new curtain rod in the living room because I had asked him to, and he had said, of course. Caroline looked at him the way you look at a stain you are not sure how to address. She was polite, technically. She said hello. She shook his hand. She accepted a glass of iced tea. But I watched her eyes go over him the way Derek's eyes went over properties, calculating, dismissing. The flannel shirt, the taped glasses, the fact that when she asked what he did, he said simply that he was retired. And when she asked from what, he smiled and said a little of everything. She called me that evening. I could hear Derek in the background. "Mom," she said, "where did you find this man?" "At the library," I said. "The library," she repeated, as if I had said I found him going through the recycling bins behind a strip mall. She said she was worried about me. She said I was at an age where people become vulnerable to a certain type of man. She said she had read articles about elder financial abuse. She asked if I had given him any money. She asked if he had asked me for any money. She asked if I knew anything about his background. I told her Thomas had never asked me for a single thing. I told her I was 61 years old and had survived widowhood, a career restart, and 20 years of holiday dinners with Derek, and that I was reasonably confident in my ability to assess a person. She said, "Mom, I just don't want you to get hurt." I said, "Caroline, I love you. Good night." My son Paul met Thomas at Thanksgiving. Paul's reaction was different. He shook Thomas's hand, asked him a few questions about the Vermont winters, and then drifted toward the football game and forgot about him, which was almost worse in its way. At least Caroline was paying attention. My daughter-in-law Trish smiled at Thomas for exactly the same number of seconds she smiled at everyone, then went to the kitchen and stayed there. This was ordinary behavior for Trish. I did not read too much into it. It was Derek who made the first real comment. We were cleaning up after dinner. Thomas had gone outside with my son to look at something in the yard, and Derek was helping himself to another portion of pie and said, without looking at me, "So this Thomas, does he have any kind of pension?" Or, I put down the dish I was holding. I said, "Derek, with great respect, my financial planning is not a conversation I will be having with you." He laughed. He said he was just asking. I said I understood. And I said it was also not a conversation I would be having with you a second time. Thomas and I got engaged in September. It was not dramatic. We were sitting on the porch swing, and he said that he had been thinking, and that if I was willing, he would very much like to marry me. He had a ring, a simple thing, 1 stone, which he had picked out at an estate jeweler, and which fit perfectly. I said yes. Then I started crying, which surprised both of us. When I told Caroline, she was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Mom, what do you actually know about this man?" I told her what I knew. I told her who he was, what he valued, how he had shown up for me over 18 months in ways that were small and consistent and kind. She said, "But what does he have? Like financially?" I said it did not matter to me. She said it should matter to me. She said if he brought nothing into this marriage and something happened to me, my estate could get complicated. She said Derek had looked into it. I asked her when she and Derek had discussed my estate. She did not have a good answer for that. I want to tell you about the 6 months between the engagement and the wedding, because this is where you will start to understand the kind of pressure that was being applied. Caroline called me every week with a new concern. Was Thomas pressuring me to change my will? Had I spoken to a lawyer? Was I planning to put his name on the house? She forwarded me articles. She sent me a name of a mediator who specialized in, she said, blended family asset protection. She mentioned Derek's opinion on the subject regularly, despite the fact that I had told her Derek's opinion on the subject was not welcome. My son was quieter about it, but said once, around Christmas, that he hoped I knew what I was doing. I told him I did. He nodded and turned back to the television. My daughter-in-law Trish said nothing directly, but she started bringing her own mother to family events, which she had never done before. And her mother, a small, severe woman from outside of Cleveland, began asking Thomas questions at every gathering, pointed questions dressed up as friendly conversation. Where did you say you were from? And you worked in what industry exactly? Vermont must have been so quiet. I imagine the cost of living was very manageable up there? Thomas answered everything pleasantly and said nothing that gave anyone anything to work with. He was unshakably, calmly himself. I loved him for it. The birthday dinner was my idea. My 62nd birthday fell on a Saturday in May, 3 weeks before the wedding. I had always wanted a proper party, not a children's party with a cake, but a real dinner. Adults, the people I loved, something that felt like a celebration of a life that had been hard and had also been good. Thomas offered to plan it. He made the reservation at a restaurant I had always wanted to go to, but never had, the kind of restaurant where the tablecloths are real linen and the menus have no prices on the ladies' side. I told him it was too much. He said it was exactly enough. I invited Caroline and Derek. I invited Paul and Trish. I invited Trish's mother because Paul had asked me to. I invited 2 of my closest friends from the library. 16 people total. Everything was fine through the salads. It was when the main course arrived that my daughter's husband said something to Thomas about the car. A comment I was not supposed to hear but did. Something about how a man who drove what Thomas drove should not be making reservations at places like this. Thomas said nothing, just smiled and poured more water into my glass. And then Caroline stood up. I thought she was going to make a toast. She had her glass in her hand. She was looking around the table. She said she wanted to say something. She said she loved me and that she wanted what was best for me. She said she had been patient for a long time. And then she looked at Thomas and she said that she was sorry, but she was going to be honest, because no one else at this table was willing to be, and that she was not going to sit here and watch her mother make a mistake she could not undo. She said he was a parasite. She said she didn't know what he had told me or what he had promised me, but she had looked into him, and she and Derek both agreed. And she needed me to hear this before the wedding. This man has nothing. He is marrying you for your house and whatever Gerald left behind, and I cannot watch that happen. Trish's mother nodded. Derek had both arms crossed and his jaw set. Trish was looking at the tablecloth. Paul was looking at his plate and saying nothing, which was its own kind of answer. My 2 friends from the library were very still. I felt the heat come into my face. I felt it in my hands. I looked at my daughter in her red dress and I thought about every school morning, every fever, every night I had sat outside her bedroom door when she was a teenager and she was crying and would not tell me why. I thought about how I had loved her so thoroughly that sometimes I had forgotten to love myself. And then I did something I had never done before. I put down my fork. I stood up. And I spoke. I said, Caroline, I am going to say this once, and I need you to hear every word. I said, you do not know what this man has or does not have, but I want you to think carefully about what you just did. You stood up at your mother's birthday dinner, in front of people who love her, and you called her partner a parasite, not because you have evidence, because he drives an old car and wears flannel shirts, and you have decided that means he is beneath us. I said, do you remember when you were 9 years old, and your father and I couldn't afford to take you to Disney World, and we went camping instead, and you cried the whole first night? And do you remember who held you? I did. In a sleeping bag, in a tent, while it rained. That was me. That has always been me. I said, I have never, in your entire life, made you feel like your worth was tied to what you had in the bank. I would like the same courtesy extended to the man I am going to marry. I said, if you cannot do that, then I think you should leave. The table was completely silent. Caroline's mouth opened. She looked at Derek. He looked back at her with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something uncertain, like a man who had pushed on a door he expected to be locked and found it swinging open. It was Thomas who spoke next, quietly, calmly, the way he did everything. He said, Margaret, if I may. I nodded. He said, Caroline, I understand why you are concerned. And he said, I should have been more forthcoming with you, because I think if I had been, some of this could have been avoided. And he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a business card on the table in front of my daughter. He said, I left my career 12 years ago because I had more than I would ever need, and I wanted a quieter life. I moved to Asheville because I like mountains and libraries and women who know where the Robert Caro books are shelved. I drive the car, I drive because it runs, and I am not interested in impressing strangers. But I want you to know who I am, because you are going to be my family." Caroline picked up the card. I watched her face. I watched it change. She looked at Derek. He reached across and took the card and looked at it, and then he put it down on the table very carefully. Thomas had spent 30 years building and selling software infrastructure companies. He had sold his last one for an amount that I did not know until that night, an amount that made the restaurant we were sitting in look like a very small line item. He was not a billionaire, I want to be honest with you, but he was, by any reasonable definition, a very wealthy man. A man who had given his name to a library wing in Vermont. A man who funded a scholarship program in 3 states. A man who had told me none of this because he had learned, a long time ago, that money changes the way people see you, and he had wanted someone who would see him first. He looked at me and said, "I should have told you sooner too." "I'm sorry," I said. "I knew you were good. I didn't need the rest." He took my hand. The table was quiet for a long time. Then Trish's mother said she needed to use the restroom, and she did not come back for the rest of the evening. Derek ordered another drink and said nothing for the remainder of dinner. Not one word. I watched him try to reconstruct himself in real time and not quite manage it. My son Paul, to his credit, was the first one to speak. He said, "Thomas, I owe you an apology." He said he hadn't said anything directly, but he hadn't defended you either, and that was the same thing. Thomas shook his hand and said he appreciated that. Caroline was the hardest. She sat very still for a long time after everyone else had started talking again. When dessert came, she was still quiet. When the evening ended and people were putting on their coats, she came to find me near the door. She said, "Mom." I said, "Caroline." She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't, but I need you to understand that it shouldn't have mattered, and I need you to ask yourself why it did." She started crying then, right there by the coat check, in her red dress, with mascara coming down her face the way it used to when she was 9 years old, in a tent in the rain. And I held her, because I am her mother, and I will be her mother until the last day I have, regardless of what she does or says or fails to understand about the people I love. But I also said, "This doesn't go away because you're crying. This is something we're going to have to talk about, not tonight, but we will." She nodded. We got married 3 weeks later, a small ceremony at the Botanical Garden with 40 guests, which is the number of people you actually want at your wedding when you are 62 years old and have nothing left to prove. My 2 friends from the library were there. Paul and Trish were there. My grandchildren were there, and my granddaughter fell asleep during the vows against my son's shoulder, which was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Caroline was there. She sat in the front row with Derek, who had bought a new tie for the occasion. She cried during the ceremony, and I choose to believe it was the good kind. Thomas and I went to the Oregon coast for 2 weeks. We walked on the beach in the mornings and read in the afternoons and ate seafood at places with plastic chairs and paper menus, because that is who Thomas is and who I love. He sent flowers to both of my children from the road. He asked about my grandchildren by name. He is, in every way that matters, a good man. When we came back, Caroline called me. She said she wanted to talk, not to apologize, she had already done that. And I had accepted it in the only real way you can accept an apology, which is by continuing to show up. She called because she had been thinking about what I said. She said, "You asked me why it mattered that I didn't know what he had." And she said, "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, and I think I know the answer, and I don't like it." I told her to keep going. She said, "I think I've been measuring people by Derek's measuring stick for so long that I forgot I had my own." And she said, "Derek's measuring stick is about money and status and appearances." And she said, "I looked at Thomas and all I saw was what he didn't have, and I decided that meant he was nobody." And she said, "That's not who I want to be." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in years." She said, "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it. For every phone call and every article and every time Derek and I discussed your estate like it was any of our business." I said, "That one's going to take me a little longer to let go of." She said, "I know, I'll wait. That is where we are now." It is not a perfect ending. My daughter and I are doing the slow work of rebuilding something that got damaged, And that kind of work does not have a tidy conclusion. My son is who he is, a good man who sometimes takes the path of least resistance and is trying to be better about that. My daughter-in-law, Trish, continues to be pleasant on holidays. Her mother has not been back. Thomas and I are happy in the way that I think only people who have lost someone and survived it can be happy with full knowledge of what it costs and with gratitude for every ordinary Wednesday, every flannel shirt, every cup of medium drip coffee, every evening on the porch before it gets dark. I am 62 years old. I have buried a husband and restarted a career and raised 2 children who are still in progress. I have learned, late but not too late, that the most important measurement of a person has nothing to do with what they drive or where they live or what card they carry in their jacket pocket. It has to do with whether they show up, whether they stay, whether they hold your hand in the dark and do not let go. Thomas does. Thomas always has. And I am done apologizing for knowing the difference. If you are watching this and you are somewhere in the middle of your own story, still in the part where it hurts, still waiting for the part where it makes sense, I want you to know this. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to love your children and still walk away from a table where they have humiliated you. You are allowed to start over at 61 in a library on a Wednesday afternoon. The rest of your life is still yours. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.